Dr. Karin Huffer is the author of the groundbreaking book, Overcoming the Devastation of Legal Abuse Syndrome. She has devoted over 20 years to researching, diagnosing, and treating post-traumatic stress disorder and other trauma conditions. She works with schools, businesses, and the judicial system to provide effective accommodations for those who suffer from disabilities. In 2008, Karin's extensive work led to the acknowledgement by the Americans with Disabilities Act that our judicial system can and does cause traumatic stress in those who seek civilized, fair, due process of law and redress of grievances. Appalled by the lack of certified ADA advocates available to assist the disabled in court, Dr. Huffer developed a comprehensive training and certification program which can be completed through webinars and online. She is Associate Professor at King's University in Forensic Psychology. Dr. Huffer is also the mother of 2 grown sons. She has had extensive personal experience with the issues she has identified. Dr. Karin Huffer, welcome to the Global Freedom Report.
Thank you, Brent.
I'm sure anyone who has even tried to move a process through the court system will readily relate to your identification of something called legal abuse syndrome. Is this a real and treatable condition, and how do you define it?
Yes, it's real and treatable. When I began the work on this 20 years ago, I had to explain it to people. And people would say, oh, you don't want to say legal abuse because you'll offend the courts and it'll come back and bite you. However, today, I don't have to explain it to anybody. Anyone who has been involved with the court system understands what I'm talking about. It's very hard to get a lawyer to go the distance with you and be able to afford it, to get into a court of law, have your case fairly heard, and come out with a fair decision. It's become almost impossible for the middle class to afford to get into court and to afford legal representation.
And everything you're saying, I know all of my listeners are going, nodding their heads. And all of it's true. However, do we turn around and say everybody who's been to court has legal abuse syndrome, or is it something that only catches on, and affects certain people to that degree? And what exactly is that? How do you define the condition?
Good question. It's really post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's called complex post-traumatic stress disorder because it comes over a period of time, not from one event. It comes from having trauma reintroduced again and again and again in a court of law over oftentimes years. I've got clients that have been to court, in court, straight through almost 20 years. They cannot get a closure. So when you have, you go to court and you have to reintroduce the trauma, every time you go, you have to tell your story, you have to have your evidence, and pretty soon you find you can't open your mail. You find that if you see the courthouse, you begin to get sick. It is not a mental illness. This is an injury. It's like if every time you went in that courtroom, somebody hit you on the knee with a hammer, and then you left, and then you came back in limping, and they'd say, well, he can't win his case, or she can't have her children, or they can't, because look they're limping. Well, the injury was caused by the stress of protracted litigation. And it's a totally preventable cause of human suffering, and that's one of the points that I really am trying to make with the work I do. This is preventable. We can change some rules. We get accommodations for the people. We see to it that they have a fair day in court. And all of a sudden their symptoms are abating. But if you don't, and the other side begins to get the idea that you have symptoms, that you're having trouble concentrating, which you do when you're in a state of trauma and stress at the same time, then you get exploited. The other side, opposing counsel, will come on you like gangbusters, and that's what they call in our system, zealous representation.
And that's how they're trained. They're trained. You know, we have an adversarial system, which means if you're on the other side of the aisle, you're the enemy, and we're trained to take no prisoners. What are the symptoms of legal abuse syndrome? And let me qualify the question, because obviously anybody who's been to court has experienced some degree of this, but not everybody gets what you would call legal abuse syndrome. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, you might have a situation, for example, where a backfire of a car triggers some kind of a memory and puts somebody into heavy-duty stress, and blood pressure goes up and all of that, and it was just the backfire of a car. Is there something similar that happens with this?
Yes, and it happens when the people walk into the courtroom once they have post-traumatic stress disorder from going to court. Every time they have to go, they become symptomatic, and that means they have flashbacks. That means that the feelings that were there when the trauma was instilled overwhelm them when they're trying to function in court. When we go to court with a client, what we find is their body might be there and they look okay, but what we know is they're unable to concentrate, they're unable to form their sentences the way they need to and think quickly on their feet when they're being attacked. And the worst thing that happens to them while they're in that courtroom is that the other side will begin to lie about them. They'll begin to tell horrible things, attack their character, injudicious remarks designed to do nothing except make them symptomatic. And then they become symptomatic and they can't function. The first thing to go is your speech and effective speech. So you'll stand there and you know what you ought to be saying and you know how you want to be handling the attacks that are coming at you, but instead what you do is usually freeze or cry. And I had one client that threw up, and she would run out of the courtroom, and I had to stop her, and I said, do not leave this courtroom when you have to throw up. Throw up in the courtroom, and preferably turn your head toward opposing counsel while they're doing these mean things to you. But do not leave the courtroom when you have to throw up.
Oh,
I
want you at my table. Oh, that's wonderful. Now, but hang on a second, because what you're describing, I know people who, for example, I don't know for sure they don't have PTSD, but they've never been to war. They've never been in that kind of circumstance. As an example, I have a friend who many, many years ago, she had to go to court, and she spent 6 months planning her case. And I helped her, but I couldn't represent her. I'm not an attorney. And she gets to the day of court. I mean, she used to have papers all over the floor, and she would study them, and I would help her so that make sure she'd understand them. So when she went into that courtroom, she knew what she had to do. The moment she got in there, she saw the judge sitting up on his pedestal. She froze. She didn't know what to say, and the case went against her because she couldn't say anything on her behalf.
There you go. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
But she had not had a previous experience of that sort. It's like she hadn't been worn down necessarily. So
but she probably had with the opposition. She probably had traumatic enough experiences. We have domestic violence situations where men and women have had horrible experiences with their opposition in the courtroom. Or, you're there for a reason. Whatever created that initial conflict, very often that's enough. You walk in the courtroom and your symptoms will start just from the opposition and the trauma that you had that brought you to court in the first place.
You mentioned in your bio that you have some extensive personal experience with the issues. Can you share with us one of your, experiences on this that you've personally had?
Well, my husband had an experience with a bank that he had a loan from, and he was building a shopping center. And what happened was certain senior vice presidents decided they wanted to take our property. And it was his work, But I watched him fight for what he believed were his rights, and he prepared, and yet once the whole process started and it became obvious that it wasn't going to be truthful and the lies were being told, his hair turned gray in about 60 days. His blood pressure got to the point of stroke level. Now, that was prior to the ADA that passed in 1990. And I remember as a psychologist watching him and watching what was going on and saying to myself, if this is just us, this is not that big a deal. We got a raw deal, you know. But if this is the way it is, it's explaining something I'm seeing in my private practice in marriage and family therapy, and that is that people who have been to court don't get better the way that people who haven't been to court do. So maybe there's something systemically wrong here. I was seeing something that I kind of picked up in my practice because people, even if they'd been to court 10 years before, had leftover trauma. And so I watched as this progressed and became aware that we needed a law. So I became involved in doing a lot of peer review, getting material out to my colleagues saying, are you seeing this too? And then in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act passed.
But before you get to that, because I want to actually talk about that, but before we get too far off the point, I had one follow-up question. You mentioned your husband, and you said that after his experience, you know, his hair turned gray and he had high blood pressure. Do I presume that before the experience, he didn't have, like, high blood pressure and he wasn't prone to it necessarily? In other words, it couldn't have been attributed to something else.
No, he was a perfectly healthy, very dynamic business person.
Amazing.
And he had always won anything in court because we were always right. We didn't break any rules or laws. And so I felt very confident. Actually, the contractor and the banker had stolen out of his construction loan. And so he figured he had them dead to rights. He had a proof of the cashier's check that had transferred.
Right. Oh, and I know
that kind of thing.
It doesn't matter. See, the key to understanding the legal system is it doesn't matter what the merits of the case are. It's all about the procedures and the processes. And to those of us seeking justice, that's unbelievably frustrating. Now, I know that you were instrumental in having the Americans with Disabilities Act recognize this as a legitimate condition. But what's the significance of that? Why is it important that the ADA recognize legal abuse syndrome as a legitimate disorder?